Hey everyone, so this is David Mario Smith. I'm here live again for another episode of The Crunch. Now, today's a special episode. I have a special guest, a fellow creative, which I always love talking to creatives because we give a different perspective on things. I know some of you are tired of hearing about AI and agentic AI all the time, so we're going to mix it up a little bit today and talk about storytelling. And so, with no further ado, I'd like to bring on Indy Sen. How are you, man?
Dave, I'm doing well. How are you? Thank you so much for
Good,
having
good,
me.
good, good. Yeah, so good to see you, man. How's it going?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. It's great to see you. I think it's been a little while now, but yeah, always great to reconnect. And yeah, I'm doing great. Summer's in full swing.
Yeah,
Just watched the World Cup. Had that going for the last like 39 days.
yeah,
And
dude.
I
What
already
a
miss it.
great World Cup, right? It was I mean, it's we're here in the Bay Area, and I remember even going down to San Jose. I mean, oh my gosh, right? It's like it was a party down there. Everything was buzzing. It was awesome. There's hundreds of people, like at any given evening.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So I would say I was traveling with the family, and we were out on the East Coast. I lived
Yeah,
there for a couple of years, and what was just great. And you remember this. You're reminded of this every couple of years, every 4 years, right? When
yeah,
the
yeah,
World Cup
yeah.
happens, is that you just see people on the street wearing that different, repping their own teams and that kind of stuff. And there's just like this sense of like kind of like brotherhood, sisterhood, right? Like like I
Yeah.
saw like people in Boston, like Norwegian fans teaching Boston like grad students who were like probably obliterated, like on the street doing the rowing chants and all of that, and that it's something special, right? So who would have thought, right, that sports would unite the world? But
Seriously, man, yeah, because the people from all over the world, it's descended on different U.S. cities, and even in Mexico and Canada. It's amazing. And
yeah,
it's funny because you're right. Sports, that is sort of this uniting thing, right? Soccer is probably the biggest sport, right? In the world, I would think. I know we get so closet here in the U.S. where we think it's basketball, baseball, and football, but
yeah. We have our own definition of world champions here in the U.S.,
yeah,
right? Like,
yeah. Oh gosh, who's that sprinter? I think Noah Lyles, right? It's like had this back and forth beef with NBA players. Like, you're not world champions, until you win in the Olympics, or like that.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Basketball, football,
yeah,
like baseball, exactly. Yeah.
exactly. But I tell you, man. But Indy, thanks so much for joining me today, man. It's I've been sort of looking forward to this one, and
Yeah.
when
Same.
you sort of built the story, and not to go through a career highlight reel, but you built a story for Box, right? MuleSoft, Matterport, it
Yeah.
took those through public. Also, you have Salesforce, Google, and Canva. And so I want to know from you, gosh, talking about the World Cup and what a great story that was. When did you figure out that story, or this story, is the product? Like what was that moment of like realization for you?
Yeah, for me, I think it all started very much in the early days when I first became a marketer, and my first gig was at Salesforce. Is
Mhm.
no matter what type of company you are, no matter what stage, like I mean, obviously, and we've been steeped in the technology space, right? So it's very tempting to kind of lead with what your product does, the speeds and feeds,
Mhm.
the innovation, right? And all of that is great. But I think to me, and especially it's becoming more and more acute, I think, in this whole age of AI, where God knows there's so many more companies now that the barriers to entry to build are much lower, is that
Mhm.
it's really easy to lead with the speed and feeds, and that's almost expected. But
Mhm.
I think the key thing is really leading with like what is sort of the the outcome that you're selling, right? And I think
Yeah.
that's true from like 20 years ago to even today, where we're all working on the coasting on these promises of like what agentic AI workflows, all these things can do for you. But at
Mhm.
the same time, everybody's saying the same thing, right? So what
Yeah.
is the promise that you can make to your customer, knowing, and this is something I learned at Google, is like, we have this kind of motto saying like, if you know the magic of your product and you know your user,
Yeah.
it's really that intersection that's the story, right, that can really like help you like stand out in the market, right? So for
Yeah.
me, it's always starts with like, look, I know we have great technology, or I'm assuming we do, right? But what is
Mhm.
that handshake we can make with the customer where ideally we take their stories and they can kind of help frame how we talk about things, as
Mhm.
well as how do we lead with that outcome, right? And in
Yeah.
marketing, a lot of that sometimes starts with basic positioning. A lot of people think about minimum viable product. I like to think about minimum viable positioning, right? Like, what is that promise you're making to your user, your customer, whatever it might be, and what is that red thread of like, technology enablement, commercial enablement that's going to help them become a better person, like a better version of themselves, right? And if you can dial that in, and not to say that it's not going to change, but if you can really start with that, the outcome, the vision of how your product helps your customer, which goes back to basic positioning, I think those are the basic strands of like good storytelling.
Yeah, it's funny, because I'm into music, right? And the reason sort of why I'm asked questions, I sometimes in songwriting, right? Sometimes you realize that a song is just not landing, right? And it's not like the beat. It's not like the even the bars or the lyrics per se is just and I just hadn't figured out what I'm saying yet. I hadn't figured out what the actual story was. Is some of that what happened to you is that moment where you're like, okay, we need to figure out what the story is here, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it's okay to strum along, right? Like, I think, like some of the biggest companies in the world, like, or again, going back to, and I know, sometimes you start your career somewhere, so you end up being like very pilled by how they think, but Salesforce, right? Like, it's routinely Mark Benioff, the CEO, will try a new narrative. Like, Salesforce is famous for kind of like, kind of spiking the new big thing every time at Dreamforce, right? And like a new vision, like repackaging what they're doing. But at the core of it is like the story, right? There's technology is changing so fast. We want to stay abreast of it. But what's that story we want to tell the market? And, I think he'll be the first one to kind of pilot something, both first with his exec team, his sales leaders, and then he'll take it on the road. And then what you typically see at Dreamforce, like Salesforce's annual conference, is that finalized version of what that story is, whether it lands or not, right? Like, but there's a lot of like strumming that happens between that first, the time the story is delivered to when it's first kind of like a nugget in his mind or that kind of thing, right? And I think I see a lot of founders do that too. And I would certainly encourage it. It's like, you're not going to get it right, but think about what are the core elements, right? And think about the basic plot, and then you'll figure out the narrative. But don't stray too much away from what the plot is, or don't be swayed by what other people are saying. Stick to your gun, right? And typically, I think that's where some of the magic happens.
It's so funny. So even to go back to like the music and songwriting, I find that if I'm listening, so I can get inspired, by other artists, different music, even as writing for tech and research writing, I get inspired, by something I see. But there's this fine line where I can get inspired and where it begins to influence me in a way that I don't, like where I need to get away from certain things, and really find the story, right? And so how do you find like the real story? You mentioned Salesforce, but where any other company, how do you actually find that real story?
Honestly, like, I think sometimes, you might have a hunch, and, I've been in product marketing for like almost 20 years now. Obviously, you know what the story you want to tell is in the market, right? You'll spend a lot of time with like product, with like engineering, that team, right? And figure out like, what's your product, the points of parity, the points of differentiation, right? To kind of go to the nitty gritty of like product marketing. But I've always found it helpful to just go out and talk to customers, right? Even if it's early, have like a good chat with them. And, now there's no real excuse not to do it, right? Like, there's so many like taking apps, so many abilities to kind of distill that information you're getting, but keep your ear to the ground, right? Because sometimes customers, whether they know it or not, might give you like obviously nothing beats a story of like traction, like adoption, knowing how they use your product. And sometimes the more complex your product, the easier it is for the customers to kind of really distill and those value propositions for you. So I think one way for me has always been to kind of take that customer sort of perspective and embrace it. And then sometimes even compare notes, being like, hey, look, here's what we're saying, but here's what customers are actually doing with it, right? How do we reconcile this? And in fact, like, shouldn't we change our positioning, right? So I think that's some of the things where I love to keep my ear to the ground. And then I think the other piece of it is, I know earlier we were saying, don't compare yourself to others, right? But I would say the one thing is like, sometimes a nice storytelling crutch is like, meet the customer where they are, but also where the market where it is, right? So I'm a huge like, pop culture nerd, like I love music, but I love movies, I love comic books, all that stuff, right? And sometimes you can often take your cues as to where, things are going, right? Like, so one example I have is, and this is, a couple of years ago, but maybe fresh in my mind because I just saw the trailer for Avengers Doomsday, right? Like, and
Yeah.
I remember when the first Avengers movie came out, which is 15 years ago. Everybody all of a sudden was like, oh my God, superheroes coming together, And this is when I was at Box, right? Where my team in particular was in charge of like our APIs, like making Box being better known as like a platform versus just like a killer, cloud file content management kind of software, right? Which is great, but our survival and a long-term, like growth would really come from like the being a platform company. And at the time, we were really jazzed about our content APIs, what my team and we called it, right? But then at the same time, we're like, well, if this is the way enterprise software, the way you're building things is going is like API first, what are some of the other, APIs out there that we can kind of like, rally around, right? So we reached out to Folio, we reached out to Stripe, and then before we knew it, we kind of came with the meme of like, innovators assemble, right? Instead of Avengers assemble, it's like, can we lead the charge with the storytelling around like, look, don't go to like these monolithical stacks to kind of build applications. Just take these best of breed APIs, whether it's in content, whether it's like in SMS communications, whether it's like payments, and so on, right? And then we started doing a bunch of like co-marketing together. And I think that's where sometimes it's the multiplicative effect of like storytelling, but also that's buttressed by, a strong kind of like meme that's out there, right? So I'm a big fan of that. So I would say it comes down to making sure you listen to what your customers are saying about your product, just so you can validate. They have so much validation in market for you. And, I think some of the sharpest kind of like distillation of what you do well comes from there, but then also embracing like some of the mega trends, right? Like, and for me, maybe that's just my orientation, but I think sometimes it's easier to kind of have like this kind of, background cultural zeitgeist moment to kind of piggyback on and, get people excited about. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny you said that because you mentioned, the sort of into pop culture, music, the art, stuff like that. And I think that's key, right? And because you used the word before, a hunch, right? Because I think having that internal feeling, right? Having something that you're drawn to, that sort of internal, sort of the feeling that you have for things, right? That transfers into the story as well, too, right? It's that feeling you have, and it's the instinct, right? And when you've hit it, right? You just know it. It strikes something in you.
Yeah. And then, I think you were touching on the artistry of it all, right? There's like art and science to marketing to everything that we do in our day-to-day jobs. But I would say, I think I've learned to trust my instincts. And sometimes, I'll certainly pitch some certain ideas, and sometimes they'll get shot down, but sometimes they'll be accepted too, right? And as I grow and as I've grown as a leader, I think the key thing is to give people that agency, that instinct, right? I think now it's very tempting. I'm seeing leaders left and right saying like, oh well, just use these agents and all that stuff to kind of carve out this work for you, so you don't even have to think anymore. And I think it should be the opposite. The onus on us is to think even more and more sharply, but then use the AI, all that stuff to kind of do more of the grunt work, right? Or to even like, give it back to you, be like a sparring partner. But for creatives, I think it's so important to still kind of listen to your instinct, right? Like, I mean, I think obviously in our field, like data counts for a lot, like traction, like you're not going to be able to wish your way out of like, proving that you have like product market fit, right? Like, I think that has to come from like, bona fides, like around like customer traction, like real, inroads in the market. But it's how you tell the story also, right? Like, can you do it in a way that's not dry, that's exciting? At the very least, it should be exciting to you and your teams. And I think that type of level of enthusiasm, I think, has always been contagious. Every time I've seen a company be in unison around how excited they are about talking about something, I think you feel that in your bones, right? When you go talk to folks at those companies, when you go to their events. We were talking about Canva Create, right? Like, there's definitely no shortage of excitement on how people internally kind of like talk about what they do. And then, I think also if you can kind of get your user base to be just as excited as you for what you're doing, then I think that's a winning sort of combination.
Yeah, because it gets to that whole, that old adage of, people will forget what you say, but they'll remember how you made them feel, right?
Absolutely.
And so a part of that storytelling is like, how are you making people feel, right? Instead of telling them something, is how are you making them feel. One of my favorite, rappers is Nas, right? And
Oh, yes.
and there's a song he did called "I Gave You Power," where
Yeah.
he tells the whole story from the perspective of a gun, not about a gun. I mean,
Oh, and it's in reverse, right? It's like a reverse flow.
yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so there's a couple. There's rewind that you're
Oh,
talking about.
rewind. Yeah. Okay.
Is I gave you so yeah, another great example. but yeah, exactly, we can go both ways. But I Gave You Power. He sort of gave it from the perspective of the gun, and you feel like the entire weight of it without him ever telling you what to think. You know what I'm saying? Like that perspective choice sort of did all the work, right? And so what you're saying is that, right? When you're telling a good story and have a good narrative, you sort of open up and you change the vantage point, and it cracks open something where the user base, people actually feel what it is you're saying, but you having to tell them.
Yeah. I mean, literally, like, and I think what distinguishes like Nas from like there's so many rappers from that era and even today who are really great at what they do, right? Like there's that storytelling, but yeah, it's really like that visceral, like kind of like level of like storytelling where you're just engulfed in what they're saying, right? Like, I mean, obviously there's a great beat, there's like some musicality to it, but when you start listening, like it all of a sudden it's almost like you're reacting to it in a way that your mind's registering what he's saying, but you don't get it yet, right? And every time you hear it again, reinforces what you want that person to feel, right? And so I think to me, good storytelling is also about repetition, right? Just because you had like a banger blog post or like a sizzle reel, you don't follow up on that. If you don't reinforce it, people are, especially in this day and age, right? Like people are gonna like forget about it, right? So I think like if you can plumb at that level of depth, and I love that you bring Nas. Like I was gonna say, like one, we're talking about gut instincts and hunches. The one thing I wasn't able to avail myself of properly was around that time in the Box era. We were trying to distinguish ourselves by bringing like different speakers at our conferences, and I kid you not, I worked with like an agency, and we were all set to have Nas be like one of our guest speakers at our developer event. And
oh, really?
in my mind, both me and this other product manager, Sean, we were like so excited that we even kind of had this, because obviously we were fans, but then we were like, this guy is actually one of the first, and this was like 15 years ago, to start investing in like the tech scene and all that. And I kid you not, it would have cost us like $40K. He was like in town. We would have been able to line it up. It was just an hour and a half of his time. But then it got shot down. Maybe I think that some of the leaders who will not be named, I don't think they actually knew who he was. And I was like, how do you not know who Nas is? But, there were only so many battles I could fight. But still to this day, one of my biggest regrets is not getting Nas, because now I think he easily charges 3 times that amount to speak anywhere, if not more.
It's funny. He's like a big investor. You're right. He's like big in tech now. It's wild. It goes from like this like street, rapper, street storyteller to like now this huge tech mogul. It's interesting how things change. But funny. And even the song Rewind, you're right. That other song too was he literally told a story backwards.
That's in Stillmatic, I think, right? Yeah.
Genius stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's funny too. And one of the things, it's funny. So similar to then, almost. Gosh, I keep bringing up music. I guess it's funny. So we talked about what you're into. You mentioned, pop culture, music, Avengers, the Marvels. But there is something to say, and I see in my own work where since I'm songwriter, musician, rapper, I produce. I do tend to follow almost like a flow of things. I deal in flow, and so storytelling, flowing. There's this sort of a sense to me of when I'm writing research, when I'm sort of analyzing something, it has to sort of flow a certain way, and in terms of beat and rhythm. So I do see what you're saying. Like you sort of go from where you are innately, and and that's that becomes your instinct, right? That becomes how you sort of move.
Yeah. I mean, I think, as we get more experience, as we grow into our roles, or like our, call it maybe your station's life, I think we were talking about instinct, right? And I think also like trusting, like, how you've been operating is like, I think for me, I'm well aware now of my own, for example, my circadian rhythms, right? Like there's some times where I'm in peak mode, and sometimes I'm just like, I can't even decide, like, like I know I need to go to sleep, but I don't know how to get there, like that kind of thing, right? So I think there's some natural rhythms to, like, how you operate as an individual. And then I think it's also true, like, like, especially as you go from organization to organization, right? Like, a lot of what we said, right, could be, I think we think of it as gospel, right? But other companies, other teams may think of it as, like, they have their own rhythms, right? And I think that's the most important thing, that technology is only going to make it easier for us to get more things done, more, like hustle harder, relax harder, right? Like, everything is geared towards us doing more. And I think that's what sometimes, maybe the powers that be want us to do. But I think, it's really important to kind of obey your own rhythm, right? And know how your teams work, knowing when are the areas where, and I've seen this, like throughout all the companies I've been at, where there's always that crunch time, right? And then then after the crunch time, there's
crunch,
time. But this whole like 996 kind of phenomenon that you kind of hear about is like, it can't always be crunch time all the time, right? I mean, like, you think about even the things we depend on, like our devices, our mobiles, all that. Like, even those things you gotta have to like plug in every now and then, right? Like, they're not going to go on in for ad infinity, right? Like, so I think to me, like, one of the tenets is know your rhythm, but also know when to plug in and when to plug out, right? Because I think the value of the work that you do when you're not kind of harnessing the right rhythm, either on your behalf or on behalf of your teams, right? Like, I think it's so important to kind of listen to kind of like yourself, right? Like, I'm a runner, so that's another one of my hobbies, and I don't think I'm as fast as I used to be, right? But I'm probably smarter than I ever was in terms of like listening to my rhythm and kind of like sticking the landing, right? Like, I've run more marathons in my 40s than I did in my 30s, right? And maybe that's just my own kind of like guilty punishment for myself, that kind of thing. But I still enjoy it, But I also know that it's much harder every time. And so I think there's no sense to expect that you can do more of that stuff, the hustle, the grind, without like recharging one more time. So I don't know if that's where you were going, but I think when you were talking about the rhythm and listening and trusting your gut, to me, I think that's what I'm seeing. A lot of people, so many people kind of like burn out so easily now without even recognizing it, because they just think that, oh, well, technology has not caught up to my ambition. But don't forget that ambition is built on like patience and being deliberate, and also like, being focused. And if you don't give yourself that rest time, all of that is for naught, right? So
that's interesting. Yeah, because so it's like, and that's, let's stay there for a second. I think the marathon stuff sort of it taught you something. He mentioned it's teaching you rhythm, it's teaching you pace, right? And so the other part of that is, when you're doing a launch, right? Like, do you ever get nervous before a launch? Or do you sort of, from that lesson, the learning from marathon, did you sort of find yourself in a? I mean, we always get nervous and stuff, but do you sort of you center yourself back into sort of a rhythm and a flow?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think whenever I help, whenever I've orchestrated launches, or now have helped my teams orchestrate launches, or, folks I work with now in advisory capacity, I think it's really important to think about, everybody looks for that big bang moment, right? Like, oh, did the launch, was it well received? Like, did we did we break tech meme, right? Did we, like, get the coverage we wanted from media? All of that stuff is super important, right? But I think it's also what goes what goes into the work before the launch, as well as like after the launch, right? So I'm sure you must have crossed paths with this leader, but she was one of like the greatest leaders I worked with, period. But at Google, by the name of Carol Carpenter, right? And one of the things that she mentioned when she was coaching us as like product marketing leaders and so on, was saying like, we all want that big pop launch moment, right? But don't forget to stick to the landing, right? So to me, the heuristic is always launch, landing, and then of course, like if you go into the whole rocketry imagery, then there's so much work that goes into before the launch, right? So the way I try to prepare for it is very similar to like also the races, right? Is the races that I run, is there's all the work that goes into it before, there's how you show up the day of, and then there's also like the recovery, right? Sometimes you might have a great day and you're like, holy shit, like I reached my goal. I'm really great about itself, but recovery is still going to be important. And then there are also days where like you don't run the race that you wanted to. Like I trained like a mofo for like the New York Marathon, like 3 years ago, and I thought I was ready. and then I just cramped up, right? And it's nothing I could do about it. And so
Yeah.
it's not a great race, but then at the end of the day, I had to be like kind to myself around like the recovery thing, right? So to me, whenever I help orchestrate launches, is like make sure you know what you're going for, and hopefully you'll meet your goals, but make sure you track the shit out of them also, right? Because I think there's pre-launch kind of like checklists, there's the launch checklist, and then there's the post-launch checklist. And I think a lot of people just focus on, obviously they have to focus on the pre, and then as soon as the launch is done, they're like, I'm done. You know, we were talking about the rhythms earlier, like you asked all of me, I'm going to sign off for the next 2 weeks, right? And it's super tempting because probably your teams are all exhausted, but it's also like the post-launch, the landing moment that's going to be really important, right? Like the day of the launch, like 2 weeks afterwards, 90 days after it, do you have the discipline to think about the metrics, look back and, be able to report out on what that happens? Otherwise, it's just a flash in the pan, right? And, I think we talk about the art of repetition. I think even internally, when you launch something, yes, as a product manager, as a product marketer, you're going to feel great about being on TechMeme, like we mentioned before, right? But beyond that, what's that metric that you're going to show back to the business? What are the levels of signups? Whatever those metrics are, right? Like have the discipline to make sure that you can give like a 24-hour report, a 90-day report, whatever the intervals of times are, because again, repetition even internally is going to be your friend.
It's funny, you're sort of laying out sort of a launch plan. It's so similar, to when you're like rolling out a record, right? And the launch of a product, right? It's the sort of the similar machine, right? That there's the teaser, the build, what you hold back, who hears it first, right? And then whether you have the follow through to actually keep it alive. To your point, right? Because you don't just have the baby and leave the baby in the hospital. You have to take this through. You got to raise the thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I think sometimes, and and now sometimes I'm like some of these companies that we all look and admire from afar, right? Like, I mean, there's some companies that are just like absolute launch machines, right? But internally, what is the cost of like that launch velocity, right? Like, I think Anthropic had, like literally like a launch for 52 days, right? Like, so in 52 days, they accomplished way more than what your average company launched in like a year in 52 weeks, right? And what I mean by that is that the pace of innovation, the level at which people are like, like looking to them to kind of get the cues of what's happening in the market, it's great. But then again, it's also dizzying, right? It's like dizzying internally as well as like dizzying externally, right? Like I think, and there are very few companies that can get away with it because again, like they are, they're obviously a business, but they're also a research organization. So it behooves them to launch things so quickly, right? Because I think they're doing it for customers, but they're also doing it for, the academic kind of side of things, right? It's almost like they're pumping out innovations and insights. So, I think a lot of people are all about that launch velocity or like kind of saying like, hey, well, we got to launch every day like Anthropic. It's like, I don't think you do, like, I mean, they are more the exception to the rule. But what you do need to do is make sure that when you do launch something, you stick to that landing. You also make sure that you're super clear on like what that launch is supposed to accomplish, who it's for, right? So I think, gosh, I'll go back to something else that Carol mentioned to us, when we were kind of like all rising in the ranks was...
Hey, Carol, if you're watching.
Yeah, Carol. One more nugget of wisdom there. But I think it's also something that I've relayed back to, like the people I work with is, I think good marketing in my mind, if you're doing a good job, if you're reducing the cost of customer comprehension, right? So I think if you're doing two things too fast, if you're trying to do too many things, yes, maybe your product can launch at a velocity, but human beings, customers, prospects, there's only so much they can take at one time, right? And so I think it's really important to make sure that even if you do have tons of innovations, go back and like to how you're to packaging up in a way in which they can grow, right? That could be your standard release marketing, like reinforcing things. It could be notes, but don't expect them to, act on every launch that you have without, especially in enterprise software, like people don't like, people like innovation, but they don't like change, right? Like, like change is something you have to be very roll out in with a lot of consideration. So I think, doing things fast does not necessarily equate to like, change, right? And I think you need to make sure that, people can trust you with what you're, putting out there. And I think it goes back to storytelling, right? Like be deliberate, but be incremental, right? It's okay to have a lot of like, points talking points and kind of have like things at a steady clip, but it's scaffolding, right? To me, basic storytelling is scaffolding. Like you can't pull them in different directions, right? Everything you have to do is deliberate but incremental.
Yeah.
And hopefully your teams internally are saying like, well, this is where we want to be, and we think we can go be there within a year, but let's also make sure that we're holding the hands of our customers and prospects as we tell the story in the market, right? And I think that's a core responsibility of like responsible storytelling, is making sure that you're not going all over the place, right? Because if you are, the number one person you do not want to confuse is a customer. The second one is like an analyst, right? Like,
don't worry about us. We're in it.
But at least as a tried and true product marketer, I think those are some important stakeholders that you think are not disregarded or like not ignored, but like sometimes people are more like, well, no, we just want to make the headlines, and you make the headlines, but maybe not in the way you intended if you're not like disciplined in your storytelling.
Exactly, and I think I love what you're saying here. It goes back to you're making something people are supposed to feel, not just receive, right? And so you have to then keep in mind who you're actually writing for, and so let me ask you, like, when because you sort of allude to when you're building the narrative, who's that person in your head? Like you're saying that you have a persona of people in your head that you're sort of writing or sort of creating this launch for.
Yeah. I mean, I think it goes back to your ICP, right? Like, like going back again to tenets of like, like core product marketing, right? Like you have to have a strong view on like, who your ideal customer profile, what that is, right? And then even then, like some of the conversations I'm having is that you might have your ICP, but then you have to be really specific on like who the personas are, right? Like, so I've always worked on products typically that have a combination of both like the business decision maker, the influencer, as well as then the practitioner, right? Like by dint of having worked on a lot of like developer products, but also productivity and collaboration. Of course, the actual user of the product is the one who you want to kind of like get interested in it. But don't forget that there's also the influencer of the purchasing decision, and then also the ultimate like budget holder, right? The decision maker kind of things, right? So whenever I work on like briefs, it's really important for me and my teams, like to really think through like who that person they're going to go after is, right? Because again, default setting, right, for so many companies is speeds and feeds, right? Like people will be so impressed by how quickly we do things, how efficient it is, how performant our product is, and that's all great. But don't forget, like what that who you're trying to convince, right? And I think to me, that's always then it's going back to almost like that reverse thing is think about like that outcome, right? Like we were talking about that Nas song, right? Like think about what that vision of like, okay, here's what happened, and now let's work back, like what the messaging elements are, the reasons to believe, the value props, and all the way down to like the core product positioning that's going to get you to that path of saying like, hey, by the time we launch this, right, we have our product and messaging primitives to these channels, sort of like surface areas where we're going to reach out to these people we want to convince to the actual outcome that we have, where they're actually using our product, and then hopefully word of mouth, kind of building the excitement around what we're doing. You have to think about where that place is before you even put pen on paper in terms of like what your messaging and things are. So whenever I work on like messaging, artifacts, positioning, I always try to myself, I've learned this from like years of like doing it, but also with like now teams and the folks I work with, saying like, look, think about that ICP and think about that persona, because you're not going to one shot it, right? Like one piece of messaging is not going to work for others. Like, for example, when I was at WeWork, we had such a strong brand, like already like product perception, but the key thing was enterprise versus like mom and pop, enterprise companies using WeWork to like your solopreneurs who have like one seat at like a random desk, that kind of thing, to even just different markets, right? Like the vocabulary, the appetite, like some of the mores of like the market. I think we had this belief where like my responsibility was to come up with a core kind of like positioning for like WeWork, for example, but then knowing that it would get remixed, like the value props, some of them believe would be very different from one market to another, right? So we had this tenet, which was core creates, field executes, right? And I think no matter where you are as a company, the reason I bring up that imagery is because again, you might have a feeling in your bones of what your product does really well, but you're going to have to impress that on the decision maker, the buyer, and the user in 3 different ways at the very least. Right? And, and then sometimes, and then in your outbound marketing, that also presupposes different channels where you want to try and meet them, right? Like if you do it well, if you're lucky, it's the same channel, right? Like I think that's, for example, so many people who are interested in AI probably follow OpenAI, Anthropic on their feed. They're ready to consume that information, but that's almost like a position of privilege. Like most companies do not have that kind of captive ear, right? So how do you make sure your message lands on the right ears? You have to think about who you want to listen.
That's so important. It's funny. So my dad is a musician. He does a lot of jazz. Right? So I grew up, going to rehearsals with him in New York City, and probably placed a 7 or 8 year old shouldn't be, but maybe we're talking back in New York City, where they had the signs like 25 cents a peep and stuff. It's a different time. This is a different time.
It's an education. Yeah.
But I'd go in and I would watch him. He'd gig with his his buddies, his band members. I'd see him writing songs at home with his guitar. Sit on bed and whatever. And one thing he always told me when writing a song, even when performing the song, so for instance, you're in the vocal booth in the studio and you wrote something, you perform it. He's like, always picture someone in front of you. He's like, never rap or sing to air to the ether. Like always visualize someone literally in front of you, and you're talking to that person. You're telling that person the story. And it goes back to how are you making people feel, right? And there's an instant connection when you envision that persona, envision that person in mind. Even what you're creating seems even more real to you, right? Because that instinct again, that rhythm, because now you have a real person that you're conveying a message to,
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I would say even so for sure, like especially in the digital era, right? Like we were talking about the importance of targeting the right audiences and feel like you're speaking directly to them. But then of course in day-to-day interactions, right? Like I remember, I had the huge honor of being on stage at Canva Create. I was just tapped on behalf of my team to deliver a message, and we're in this YouTube theater, right? Like with 3,500 people staring at you, and then God knows how many people streaming live. And one of the things I remember from just taking public speaking classes and that kind of stuff is to your father's point, right? Is look people in the eye, even if it's dark, look at one segment of the audience, deliver one piece of your message, and then look at the other piece. And of course, there's a teleprompter, so you can't lose that. But I think it's sometimes it feels like it's easy to kind of be like, oh, I'm on a teleprompter, I'm just going to give this thing and speak to the ether. But at least for me, where I felt where I got my confidence from was saying look, I don't know who's in the audience, but I'm looking at some folks right in the eye right now. And, I think, I don't know if it's going to be off, but I'm going to feel good about at least telling that story, because otherwise it just feels so impersonal. Right. And I think I believe that, right? Like when the greatest performers, I don't know how much more music analogies we're going to do, but, for me, one of the concerts I wish I had gone to was, Usher's residency in Vegas. I don't know if you've seen social media clips from that. He's on roller skates, and then he goes and walks up and starts singing a whole song just to one person. Of course, the Riz is off the charts, right? As the kids would say for someone like Usher, it's all it has been. But I think people will remember that, right? Even if you're not the person he's singing to, the fact that he was having this visceral connection with people in the audience. I think that's that's where you shouldn't forget that it's still an art, right? And where it's super emotional. But I think is it instinctive? I'm sure, right? But it's also probably planned, right? He's hey, I'm gonna go out today, and Usher, you're gonna go up section C today, okay? Doesn't matter who it is, just go there. And he's okay, I'll get on my roller skates and do it, right? So
exactly.
Yeah, so I think it goes back to, there's a lot of forethought that goes into that, right? Planning, but then it's just how you show up, right? And I think, it's very clear to me when I see people, at keynotes, executives, it's very clear to me who's just focused on the notes and oh, I got to deliver this, and then the delivery is kind of flat. You can say the most interesting thing on the background, but sometimes the delivery is flat, right? So
absolutely.
That I think having that connection, and it doesn't come naturally, but it's something you can practice, is
absolutely
look people in the eye, right? Or know who you're speaking to and speak just to them. because the enthusiasm, the authenticity you have when you speak to them is going to, I think will be felt no matter who the person dialing into it is going to be. So I think that's also a key part of like storytelling is the authenticity part of it.
That's so on point, and I think you allude to before, with AI now, AI is kind of made polish free, right? And so you can generate like a slick launch now, right? And it looks all slick and stuff, but that authenticity piece of it, that personal piece of it, that storytelling, right? And let me ask you, does the advent of AI and what it allows you to do now, does that make what you do harder or even more valuable?
That it's a great question because I think if you had asked me this like 6 months ago, I probably would have a different answer. I think there's no doubt that AI is making some things easier, right? Like barriers to entry. Like there's some basic things like where I think where the outcome is deterministic, right? No question, AI is going to make that thing easier than ever, right? Like for example, I mean, I've built websites over the time, but I definitely vibe coded my my own consulting website, right? Like and I knew what I wanted, and
guilty as charged. Yeah,
exactly. I spent on it. I'm super happy with the result, like and that kind of thing. So that's what I would call like a determinist outcome, right? Like there's like AIs, it would be silly not to use AI for those kind of things, right? But then I think when you think about probabilistic outcomes, right, which I think is a cornerstone for like me as a marketer, there's only so much, preparation will take you to one level, but then of course there's a certain element of chance on whether your messaging lands flat or not, or whether those kind of things, right? So I think that part is where I think the human in the loop stuff is going to be so much more important, right? So, and I think the reason I say this is because, 6 months ago, I would have told you is like, oh, AI, I can one-shot the deterministic stuff and I can probably get 90% of the way there with like even the the probabilistic thing I want, right? It could be like an essay I'm writing, like some like artifact that I'm developing. But then when you go there, you feel really good about having a blank page to react to. But I think now the way I'm thinking about it is that, on the probabilistic stuff, like AI is still a really good sparring partner, but it's not going to get you it's not going to get you the last mile thing that you want, right? Like that's where the human in the loop stuff is going to be important. And I even think at the first mile, it's more important than ever to kind of give the right directives to the AI to kind of get to things that you can react to, right? So I think the prototyping, the throwing the darts on the board, let AI do that stuff, but then figure out like, are you on target? Are you and don't it? I think I might butcher this because I just read this like last night when I was kind of winding down. So I think I got the gist of it. But there's this great article by David Brooks on The Atlantic about like, how AI should be used, right? And he was talking about people with like, there are different levels of cognition that you bring to the table. And I think for a lot of people, AI is going to be like a crutch, or especially for the deterministic stuff, nobody should be bad about having AI doing the things for you. But your work involves more things where it's really your judgment, your taste, your acumen that feeds into the product that you want to have. AI it's like a double-edged sword, right? Like you rely too much on it, you're just going to start creating that slop, and then that slop makes you sloppy in your thinking, right? So that's what I'm paraphrasing the article. But I think at the same time, if you can stay sharp on what you want, then AI is to me is a great sparring partner. So to answer your question, I would say like I think it's both, right? Like I think it's a mix of like things where you're like, I can't imagine what my job would look like now without AI. But I also want to make sure that AI is just one of the tools that I have in my arsenal to kind of get things done at a higher degree of quality. And I think that degree of quality comes from folks like us, right? Like I mean, not us, everybody, right? Everybody has their own bar, their own affinity, the things they want to say, how they want to say it. And I don't think AI is, there might be a time where AI is literally your second brain, like there's style guides, like things that it's super perceptive, and I use it as my proofreader, as like my editor for some of the things that I write. But at the same time, like, we all like works in motion too, right? And like, I think sometimes the way I want to say something might change from, 1 week to another, or, certainly as time has gone by, like, my writing has changed and that kind of stuff. And I have the tools that can help support that. That's great. But long answer short, it's not a silver bullet. And we have to be very careful about how much we let AI kind of like pervade our everyday kind of like workflow. I mean, think of it as like a tool, but not as like, the end all be all, right? Like it's not going to replace you, hopefully,
Hopefully.
but you should wield it, right? Like I think I can't think of anybody who's not going to be augmented in any way by like being masters at how they use AI, but can't be for everything. It's just for the things where it should bring value to you and your contributions.
You're right. Yeah. And I think the gem in what you're saying around judgment and taste, right? Taste is, I mean, how do you count for taste, right? Because you're right. Yeah. I can vibe code this thing. I can, like design this prototype, and it, it has all the brand colors. It's, the palettes, right? But the thing's ugly, right? And so how do the design? So funny. My brother, he's a UX designer, graphic designer.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
We talk about this all the time, right? Where he's like, yeah, I mean, yeah, you use all the right colors, but it just doesn't look, like, so judgment and taste is that's the human in the loop element, that emotional part that you just can't replace with that. You cannot replace that.
No, I agree. Yeah. And like, it's definitely going to get better, but I think so will you, right? Like, I think the more you can do, the more you can put yourself out there and work on your things of highest contribution, and AI is like a tool that helps you get there. That's going to be great, But a lot of people are fond of saying, and I think this is true, right? Like literally, is that the AIs we're using right now are probably the worst they're ever going to be. They're only going to get more performant, right? But I think
absolutely
the flip side of that is that I think with the help of these tools, I think you can, going back to the story elements where you had, like, I think we can do things that now we used to aspire to, but didn't either have the mental capacity or, honestly, even the financial capacity to do things, right? Like for me to spin up my own website, years ago, I probably would have had to pay a designer. I can probably afford it. I like to think that I can, but now, I feel pretty good about the product that I have without having to do that. And I know designers who are listening are probably, well, I'm going to look at your website and I'm pretty sure it's going to be crap, right? But and hopefully, folks like that, like they don't feel alienated by the tool. They feel empowered, right? And I think that's going to be the key, right? And it doesn't matter where you are in life, what kind of practice you do. Like, I think the promise of any good technology is that it just empowers you behind the scenes, right? Like, that Arthur C. Clarke quote, right? Like, I think you know which one I'm talking about. I'm trying not to butcher it, right? But any technology that's sufficiently advanced, feels like magic, right? I probably completely butchered it, right? But great technology is the stuff that happens in the background, right?
Absolutely.
And I think let's not forget that we are the ones who are inventing all this stuff, building it, right? So we should never take backstage to the technology, right? And I think that goes back to storytelling. You might be an innovative company, you might have a killer product, but don't let that be at the foreground. Think about the outcomes. Think about like the story you're telling in market and why you're different, right? Like that should be in the foreground. And then the technology is just a proof point, right?
Yeah, and it's funny. And speaking of AI, and you alluded to this before, and so I cover the space, right? Whether it's AI, agentic AI, CX, and that convergence of CX and then EX, and CX sort of been the rallying piece around where we're seeing a lot of the AI advances, Salesforce and from even Adobe and NICE and Genesis and all these big companies are Microsoft, right? The Zoom now, right, and so forth, and even Google. But one of the things we see, and you sort of alluded this to before, is that everyone's telling the same identical story, right? All the buzzwords: agentic, autonomous, context aware, intelligent orchestration, and you can swap the logos, right, and not notice the difference because everyone's saying the same thing. And so, how you're advising founders now, right, in the middle of this? What are you telling founders and startups now?
Yeah, I would say, again, it goes back to me. I think it's yes, for sure. If you don't have AI powered, AI fueled in your deck somewhere, first of all, investors, especially if you're a startup, they'll be like, well, thanks for the time, but we are looking specifically for like a thesis where you're using this, right? Like where you're coming with a point of view in the market, and obviously this has to be AI powered. And it's not to say that everything is going to be AI powered, right? There's some still stuff in what is it, like capital intensive industries, oil and gas and all of that, where AI is only going to get you somewhere. There's still like mechanical engineering, like IP innovation, that kind of thing. But what I tell founders is that is think about what that point of view you're bringing to the market is, right? Because I think having that conviction on like how you're addressing a certain problem and why you're the best team to kind of like address that problem, or you're thinking about it in a novel way, I think those are really what people want to hear about, whether you're an investor or even like a customer, right? And so two things I'll say. One is, what I was alluding to is, lead with like, what, think about your minimum viable positioning, going back to that, right? And saying like, hey, here's where our product is right now, and our approach is different because of XYZ, right? And of course, in those XYZs, there's going to be AI powered this, there's going to be APIs, there's going to be whatever it is that you have, right? But I think, and then also having some early kind of like, the second thing is having some early sort of like traction on like what people are building or how they're using your product, right? If you have like even those early design partners, that in of itself is such a huge differentiator from somebody who's just leading with the technology that they're kind of like incubating and playing around with. Like design partners, early stories of traction, even if you end up pivoting, is only going to establish more confidence in somebody who's looking at your pitch, whether they're like a prospect or like a customer or like an investor, right? I think that's going to be one thing. And then taking a step back, right? Like I'm looking at all these hyperscalers essentially saying many of the same things, right? Because they're literally building the same thing, right? Like the fact that, like what is it like, Meta was investing like crazy and like, all these data centers, and then only to realize that, well, they may not be building this thing themselves, but right now, okay, let's now use that as like, capacity that we can sell, right? So overnight is going in like AWS's business, and I'm sure they'll be successful in some ways, right? But like I think that it kind of put the cart before the horse, right? And I think what's really going to be key is, and this is where actually, almost on the flip side of things, I think like Apple's done something really interesting in this whole AI era. It's like they're just waiting to, not that they're waiting to see what happens. I think they've invested heavily in different things, but to me, I don't know if you saw this, like the most interesting thing that came out of that developer conference, and I'm still a nerd for this. I still like tune into all these things.
Still tune in? Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And ever since Steve Jobs launched like the iPod, and that's what I feel like that's my origin story as a marketer, is just like, it's like, oh, I don't know who put that story together, but I want to do this, like that. That's why I think I got an early passion for that stuff. But going back to WWDC, to me, the most interesting they had was like, and I don't know if you saw it. I think maybe I feel like you would probably be predisposed to kind of like zeroing on this. It was this like just this diagram, right? Like it literally felt like a PowerPoint, right? It was like the circle where they talked about their devices, their services, and then all this like things, these areas like where they're saying like, here's where we're investing in. But to me, what was really interesting is like they were just doing like core. What a great architecture is supposed to do is showing you how you as a company, as a vendor, understand the world, right? As quickly as it's changing, right? That was their kind of thesis, being like, look, we don't know where all this is going. Here's where the part that we play. Here are the things that we're interested in. And I think to me, and hopefully this is the gist of this, or like people like the developers looking at this. To me, like what was really interesting is what exists at the negative space around that diagram, because that's where the islands of innovation, the next great app, the next Uber, the next Airbnb is going to come from. Is like, okay, Apple's laying the groundwork of like how we need to think about what these new picks and shovels coming our way are going to be, right? But that should give me license to think about that negative space. And AI is not going to do that for me. That's people like you, people like the thousands, millions of entrepreneurs out there, billions even, we're going to be like, I now know what I have to work with, and I want to build something that does this, right? It doesn't have to be everything. But so I think to me, going back to, the advice to both founders, but even these hyperscalers is like, don't forget that having an opinion and conviction on how you think about the market is what the guidance that people are looking for. Like, because nobody has figured out like where all this stuff is going. But I think where you instill the most confidence is saying like, look, based on where what we believe where the stuff is going, here's what we can offer you, right? And if you come on board with us, we're going to make sure that at the very least, you're going to stay on the cutting edge of what's happening, right? And I think I saw that early days, Salesforce, I saw it with Box, fast forward to even Canva, right? Like I think having the conviction, a lot of conviction in how some of these companies talk about their wares, some of the companies I advise, some of the companies I talk to, I know immediately when a founder is convinced about what they're doing, right? And they're not just doing it by the numbers or trying to get to an outcome of like those kind of things. I think having that conviction, and also, what is it, like strong opinions weakly held, being like, look, this could change overnight, right? The minute like Anthropic comes up with a new model or new modular cloud that Sherlock's our product, right? That might happen, but for now, this is where we are, right? And I think me leading with that confidence, that point of view, that kind of give your customer, that investor, your prospect, the lay of the land as you see it. I think that's going to be where you shine.
Yeah, exactly. And funny, I wonder too, have you seen where the story is, kind of better than the product, right? Because have you been in those rooms before,
Yeah, exactly, right? So there's like, the vision, the ability to execute, right? Like that, you have to have all that covered, right? And so back to your question about founders, you have to show that you have the vision, the conviction, but also the bona fides of your product, like the ability to execute and those kind of things. But then that's also true for the hyperscalers, right? Like there's I think once upon a time WeWork was like a hyperscaler in the space that we were, right? And we were very ambitious with what we were doing, but then there were also some things that we were putting out there which had nothing to do with our core business, right? And we're just like, people are like, well, so tell us about this wave pool thing that you're doing. We're like, I was on marketing. I had no idea what that thing was. And, it was one of the things I had in my rude FAQs being like, oh yeah, maybe you should talk to so-and-so about that, analyst briefings or whatever, like press briefings. But yeah, again, showing that and I think focus again is going to matter too, right? Like, so that's why it's really important not to think about having that FOMO of like, fear of missing out, of even fear of being misunderstood, right? Like around like what people may think or are expecting of you. Just come up with something where you're really convinced, you have the evidence, the credibility to prove it, and just go for it. And of course, things you might pivot, your product might pivot, your messaging will pivot. But I think that I think people are more and more, those are the affordances of this day and age, right? Like I think just as much, it's going to be easier than ever to kind of pivot and change things. But
it's awesome. Yeah, it's that, to what you're saying, it's that conviction of the story, right? Knowing who you're telling it to, right? Creating that connection and letting them feel it, rather, as opposed to just receiving it. Let them feel it as they're receiving it. Making that connection with the persona, your audience, the user base, the analyst, partners, even, right? Because now we're dealing where it's all about ecosystem, right? And so it's like, how is that message being received across the ecosystem?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, maybe one of the last things I'll share is like, this is one of my beliefs is, that a good platform is a good story, but a good story is also a good platform, right? So I think that's why, to me, it's so important, right? Like, especially as almost every company now is going to be in the ecosystem business, right? If you think about every SaaS company under the sun, overnight, they have to think about what their agentic interfaces look like, right? Like you have to go from like having sharpened and honed their, their go-to-market execution on this notion of selling user per month logins to now selling packets of, I don't know, API calls, tool calls to agents, right?
Yeah.
And I think that part of the story, like almost overnight, every company is going to become a platform company, whether they know it or not, right? Like I think people said, a couple of months ago, SaaS is dead. Like, no, I don't. I think if anything, the companies that don't make that platform sort of like pivot, or at least open the aperture to include that platform component of their go-to-market, those ones are going to be dead, right? But the ones that embrace it, I mean, if anything, it's going to be like a lever of growth. And, and I think that's where, where it's super exciting times for like some of the stuff that we're doing now. Cause like, I think, again, it goes back to, a good story. I think it will be a great precursor to your platform success and vice versa.
Indy, I gotta tell you, so we usually cap the show off at 30 minutes, right?
Oh gosh, yeah. I'm looking at the time.
So this has just been just a great, like I actually lost track of time. And so because I was engaged, I was so enthralled in the conversation. So that's a testament to you, my friend. It's been great speaking with you. Like, you've been so insightful, engaging. It's been conversations, but I hopefully people got something out of this. It's going to be on demand as well too. Indy, thanks, man. Awesome. Thanks for coming on, talk with me. This is good. We got to do it again because we could have kept going.
Yes. Yeah. Like Captain America, we can do this all day, right? So
exactly, man.
Yeah. No, that's great. Dave, thank you so much for having me. And I know we want to be respectful of everyone's time, but hopefully this resonated. And and I would love to do it again. And always a pleasure to see you, my friend.
Awesome. Thanks, my man. We do our true crunch.